The final speaker tonight will be Dan Spiegel. Dan is founding partner with Megumi Aihara of Spiegel Aihara Workshop, or SAW, in San Francisco, California. Dan received a Bachelor of Arts in Public Policy from Stanford University and a Master of Architecture degree from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He currently teaches architecture at UC Berkeley and at California College of Arts, or CCA. SAW is a transdisciplinary design firm operating at the nexus of architecture, landscape, and urban design. This mix allows them to work across scales, from the tactile object to the city, and across timelines, from the immediate to the ecological. Their work has earned numerous awards, including the Young Architects Honorable Mention from the Architects Newspaper Best of Design Awards, an AIA San Mateo County Design Award in Achievement of New Residential Design for their project Low Rise Housing, or Low Rise House, an honorable mention in the International Design Awards for Tryon Truck, and an AIA San Francisco Award for Architecture for their project A to Z House. The office's transdisciplinarity, I think, also speaks to an interesting relationship in their work between control and lack of control, between specificity and ambiguity, maybe even between the objective and the subjective. This appears, I think, most clearly in the single-family homes that SAW has designed. There is an inherent struggle between the custom individuality that's so easily designed and produced in the single-family home typology, relatively speaking, and the market-driven desire for the collective or even objective value. The balance and conflict of these two conditions seems to be developing into ripe territory for the office and allows them to produce work that, while being designed specifically to a very particular environment, economy, program, and/or client, also develops wide appeal and multiple understandings of inhabitation and use. Please join me in welcoming Dan Spiegel.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that kind introduction, and also for your part in shaping the prompt for this competition. It has led to, I think, is a really fascinating collection of work that also seems to have a lot of heart, which is, I think, a really positive thing for us all. Thank you so much to Anne for your stewardship of this program. It's an incredible opportunity that you've created for us, and it's great to be here with these other people who are part of the program as well. Thank you for your help arranging all of this, Katerina. I want to call attention to my partner, Megumi Aihara, who's a founding partner at SAW, who should be up here too, but had the poor sense to graduate a year before me. Thank you to the team at SAW, including Sharon Ling and Kenneth Hu, and a special thanks to Max Obata, who basically spearheaded the design and construction of the models in the exhibit. And then thank you to frequent collaborator Dustin Stevens, and then for exhibit help from Jeremy Ferguson, Colin Griffin, Alex Cabana, Helen Han, and Darcy Spence. So I'm going to tell something like a story, but before I do, I want to mention some background that might be helpful. Our office is a hybrid of architecture and landscape architecture. Whenever we mention this, people say, oh good, inside and outside. And while we think this is good, we think it's more important still how this combination helps us think about time and its role in defining objectives through experience. When I was in architecture school, I went to see a movie about an indie rock band, which somehow turned out to be the story of a singer looking into his late dad's work in quantum physics. There was a cat in a box and light particles fired at two slits. Supposedly, until you open the box, the cat is both alive and dead. This is a section of the slits that I came across recently. From what I gathered, it seems that there are infinite possibilities for any situation until you observe it. Take a look and define the object. Yes. There are probably some obvious times to observe things: the start, the end, maybe the middle. But there are also the ones that you don't expect. After the end, before the beginning. I designed a house around a tree that doesn't exist yet. When the house is built, I'll plant the tree and it will grow. But at any given moment, it's not done yet, but it's also not incomplete. Choose how you look at a particular time and set the objective. My dad mentioned to me the other day that this might have something to do with Kant's critique of pure reason, whereby, quote, the schema of reality is existence in a determined time, unquote. With apologies to Michael Hayes, I can't remember if that's the case. Anyway, my dad's not a physicist or a philosopher, he's a psychiatrist, which is maybe somewhere in between. His parents were psychiatrists too. They raised him in Long Island, in a house designed by a guy named Alfred Levitt. My dad remembers the house as bright, warm, and airy. It stuck with him. That's him there, 1957, and that's him over there in 2018. The house remained for some time, but Alfred, the architect, and his brother were more interested in the economics of mass-producing housing. In case you're wondering, that's Levittown on the right. It seemed like a pretty good idea, but when I went to Florida in 2008, I saw it again, or at least some version of it. All of the repetition felt so generic, like isolation or loneliness. This is some version of that in Cape Coral, Lee County. At that time, it often ended in foreclosure, especially in towns like Cape Coral. Palm trees were stolen from front yards of abandoned homes. It even changed the electoral map. I heard on a radio that the real estate companies would sometimes hire fake families to come in and stage the homes. Then again, Robert Venturi made a house with fake rooms for his real mom. You probably already know, but there's another stair that doesn't go anywhere at all. My mom moved around a lot, but never knew who built her homes. This is one of them in Arlington, Virginia. It was nondescript, but still memorable. It seems that as a kid, she gravitated towards pools of light pouring over the breakfast table. She still does. She talked about this often, those fleeting conditions of light. I might be reading too much into it, but I think the lesson was things change. Kids get older, families grow and shrink again. So I set out to design a more adaptable house, part tower, part ranch, part horizon. Google found out about the new house right after the foundations were poured, which seems like all it knew for years. Eventually, they developed some new tools and observed the site once again. And again. Maybe that's when it became real. The house has a plan, of course, with 4 crossing bars relating to programmatic arrangements and variable densities of living. But more importantly, it's supposed to feel like spaces suspended within the landscape, like particles, like light particles scattering through slits. Every interior is suspended between at least 2 exteriors. This is what it looked like to a photographer on July 27, 2013. I've seen these photographs enough now that it's easy to imagine that the setting for the house is in fact a day, July 27, 2013, rather than a place, Menlo Park, California. Even still, some moments were taller than others. Some longer. Some less defined at the edges. Some more continuous. And some entirely fleeting, despite the solid materials. This is how it looked to me at a particular time that day. And 20 minutes later that day, some things change faster than others. It might be entirely different on another day. I've come to realize that the landscape shapes buildings whether you think about it or not. Seedlings grow into trees and spread into ecosystems. It's also just space, like anything else. To the garden is the bedroom a courtyard. Which one is changing more slowly? I started to wonder, how do you know what something actually is if it changes every time you look at it? We designed this little structure to change, but notice that it behaves a little differently when it lives on Treasure Island. Some of this is just a regular routine. Arrive, open the door, fold open the walls, hang the bench and desk, and invite people in. But places like Union Square in San Francisco seem to agitate it in other ways. Maybe all the attention requires a bit more privacy, more modesty, or maybe a little less. Certainly this setting seems to be a little less. Anyway, this is the only location where you can always find the truck. It's meant to be flexible, but this one was always a nomadic lingerie store, of course, with changing rooms and algorithms for finding bras, and as much privacy as you're in the mood for. But at the end of most nights, everybody goes home and it just has to look like a lantern, or at least something warm, if slightly unknowable. Like I said, it's meant for lingerie, but if I'm being honest, the truck was born from studies of thousands of mobile homes. All basically the same at the start, but pretty different by the end, and printed upon by local codes, fashions, or weather. There's still a lot more that can be done. Anyway, back to the truck. Sure, it folded open, but always in a lingerie store kind of way. But someone else in Vancouver looked at it and thought of a meditation studio, so he asked us to turn it into one. It's just like a lingerie store, but with more clothes, fewer partitions, more privacy from the outside, less privacy from the inside, and needed to double in size as soon as the truck stopped. But that wasn't the end. At least 20 other people from around the world called us with their own sincere, fairly serious ideas about what it could be. A coffee shop, a Christian bookstore, an artist cabin, a fast casual cafe, a DJ booth, a jewelry store, a sunglass boutique, coffee scrub skincare shop. Eventually, we had to make a chart to keep the project straight. Just last week, we actually started turning one into a barbershop. I saw another company testing out naps on a truck. Always up for an adventure, I stopped in. I thought the nap was pretty good, and I bought a mattress. Coincidentally, they asked us to design a new office and workshop for them a few weeks later. I wish it always worked this way. This is a nice truck, I should note, but we did not design it. They were mostly concerned about where the different walls would go in order to separate out all the different things you do in rooms. It was a fair point, but we were more interested in the continuity and textures of the ceiling. Since we were trying to drape curtains made of steel and hang a cloud made of pillowcases. It's not every client who has 117 extra pillowcases sitting in a warehouse nearby. So back to the walls. We compromised. There are rooms, but not many doors. Walls are usually very solid, but look like fabric. Corners are rare, and walking feels continuous. It's actually pretty practical when you think about how these things get made. Our photographer Bruce saw it that way too on August 25th, 2017, though he was mostly standing still. The furniture had to follow the rules too. Be solid, but act like fabric. Avoid corners where you can. And try to maintain some continuity between things. A few years earlier, we spoke with a Sioux tribe from South Dakota. They were promised some money to build housing. And while money is temporary, traditions last a long time. So we started by designing a pavilion for the yearly powwow to be built with the tribe out of local materials like rammed earth and straw. Really, we were trying to design a process. But a process can be a place too, and it can be helpful to have a place to make plans. Each fall, the pavilion gets a little bigger, so the younger generations can practice building. Each year, there's more space for the community to gather. And with practice and planning, make housing. And as the tradition goes, the money stays here. The older clusters of structures are still there too, like a physical memory. I heard on a podcast recently that every time you remember something, you damage the memory a little bit. That makes it tricky to design a memorial, including this one for Harvey Milk. Lots of people care about him and have their own image in mind. You see images of his face the most often, but if you zoom out, he was often up on a soapbox with crowds of people around him. Each of those people has their own image in mind from their own particular point of view. But these images often compete, and the more you talk about it, the less you might actually remember. A structure is a start, Even better if it reflects the community, literally perhaps. But the thing about a movement is that it doesn't stay still. Maybe a memory can be better served through a kind of procession, a sort of ritual about a person that you can know and do without really having to think about it too hard. Maybe it becomes more of a habit than an effort. Would that leave the real memory more intact? I think it matters when you see a place. If you happen to be in Tahoe on Labor Day, for instance, first you notice the mountains, of course. Then you might see all the estates around you and think they're going to good use. But it turns out most of the time they're empty. There's a 65% residential vacancy rate in the area. I'm sure that's frustrating to the seasonal workers in the winter. Surprisingly, most of the vacationers come in the summer. It seems that everyone might benefit from sharing. Sometimes you need a whole house. Often you just need a part of one. And everyone has different ideas about when to stay, so why resist that? This is Martin Luther King weekend, probably in 2 years. On January 20th, for instance, the homeowner and her family wake up in the Red Tower, while their friends from Vermont are playing with their kids in the Green Tower, and 3 lift operators here for the season from Chile rent space in the Blue Tower. The couple from Vermont hears about the best trails over breakfast from the younger lift operator, while Grandma reads stories in front of the fire. They just met. You can divide up the towers if you want, but you don't really need to. If you ever run out of room, you can always add a tower and connect it. Most of the action is in the spaces in between. It looks a little different every day. I met a couple with the most unusual house in that it was totally typical but meant for a different place. It was low and freestanding and seemed overwhelmed by the city. I kept drawing the elevations as carefully as I could, noting the neighbors and at least some of the textures. This one seemed to come pretty close, but I have to admit that I didn't realize the western light would turn half the windows gold, and the eastern light would turn half the windows blue at a particular time of day. I knew it was important to draw the depth of things. The building was pretty accurate, but as the trees grew and the shadow patterns became hard to anticipate. And then the couple got pregnant and had twins, and by the time the house was done, so in those drawings, it's hard to see, but if you look closely, the house has lots of space. And in the photos, it was just barely enough. Shortly after I finished school, I met an oncologist and his wife. They asked me to design a new outdoor space for throwing parties and playing with their son. There were old trees on a steep hill over a valley, and we decided to extend a path into the sky, capture the thrill of possibility. The son started high school, won a science competition, and then suddenly died of a brain tumor. It's hard to imagine their sadness. They told me they still go here, but this perch now brings them some solace. There was a story written in a magazine about the family a little while later. The oncologist's father said, quote, "From the very beginning, based on what I knew about this particular disease, I knew the chances of beating it were so small. It's more frustrating and anxiety-provoking when you know what the outcomes are. You feel helpless to do anything, and yet you try." I think about this a lot. Most projects start with an impulse of optimism, but outcomes are harder to anticipate, harder to define. Objectives change depending on how and when you look at it. So, we look again and again, even after the fact, hopefully from a new angle at each point. On the left is a hallway animated by the ginkgo tree in the courtyard. On the right, an oblique section at 12 degrees along the slightly torqued axes of domestic work and play. I already knew we could build a roof within a roof, but a new look at the section along line C revealed an opportunity for the intersection of internal and external light. Would the changes in color of the sky animate the interior of the critical oblique section at 7 degrees along diagonal from grid line 2A to the sunrise over Sutro Tower? It wasn't until we opened things up that we fully imagined the elevation detail at the edge of Planning Code Section 134 exemption, giving 3 brothers parallel rooms. Look again, and the shared moments become the most specifically defined in the satellite view at 36 feet above average site grade from the top of winter snowpack. The seasons become more stable if viewed from a worm's eye section, a frost line threshold 53 inches below natural grade. And the roof becomes the topography. Look again, and the stable image gives way to the convergence of processions between memorial and routine. At this particular moment, it's almost certainly not quite done yet. Thank you.